So also for me it's a pleasure to be here after a few months, because indeed I was here, was it in June, July? May, having another discussion about labor reforms then. And so it means that Warsaw is very lively, and it's a kind of laboratory where ideas are discussed and perhaps put in practice. Apart from this, I think that Nicholas Barr's presentation just proves that, or at least to me, there is a large consensus today among researchers on pension economics. We have studied pensions for decades now. We have met, discussed, published, and there is a kind of consensus applied to policies and so on and so on. And we typically start or end our presentation by saying there are lessons for policy. It happened to me that I was in policy making because I was part of a government. So my lesson today would not be for policy making, but from policy, from the political experience that I had. I would like to draw some lessons. And the lessons to me, well, first I experienced a great distance between, let's say, studying a problem and having to decide on people's lives. These are completely different things, because when you publish, when you write, you can be really quite free. Research is independent by definition. When you are there and you have to decide, things are completely different and you are personally involved. So the doubts, all the question marks surface. And this should be a lesson in the sense that perhaps academics should be less arrogant. Economists have been, we know that they have been, and after the crisis we know that they should be less arrogant and listen more to other people, and this I am convinced of, but also should perhaps collaborate. Collaboration is comes from both parties. So collaboration means also that politicians or policymakers have to listen. In some places it happens, in other places policymakers are simply, you know, they cannot stand experts telling them what to do or how they should design the policy. So there are many things that I would like to say. I will completely leave or almost the pension issues, because they have been dealt with by Nicholas before, and I would concentrate more on labor. The title is Pension and Labor Market Reforms in an Integrated Approach. I do not have a general theory, but by experience, again, as Italian minister, I had to prepare the pension reform, and I will show you in a minute, and the labor market reform. And I am absolutely convinced that one of the two things that were Nicholas' conclusions is true, and that is to have a good pension system, the best thing is to have a well-functioning labor market. This is the first condition, because if you have a poor performing labor market, then you can do whatever you like in terms of policies, but then pensions will always be somehow inadequate under various perspectives, maybe even under the question of fairness, so granting, for example, privileges to strong groups and paying too little to a weak group of society, to the weakest group of society. So that is labor and pension reform should be integrated, but it's not the typical way that policy go. In our case, for example, I just want to show you, how do I do this? Doesn't work?
Use the cursor down key. Cursor down.
Which one? Okay. I want to take this, which is the famous, you know, this graph. It is in every economic textbook. And this is the life cycle hypothesis by Franco Modigliani. And it is designed almost as Modigliani had in mind. So one thing, you cut childhood. And that is already a problem, because we know that in childhood is exactly where people start creating their future. So if we consider the insurance of risk in a comprehensive way by policy also, and so by public insurance, by social insurance, the first things to do would be to integrate education and childhood into the life cycle. Because that is not only a question of how parents do, but it's a question for society to design a better future for the young generation. But I do not talk about this, but of course the major inequalities start exactly in this period, which was not really included in Franco Modigliani analysis. But then Franco Modigliani thought of something which Nicola described before, which is a working career. You work, you have, by working, an income which is smooth and increasing and continuous. You start here, this is your income, labor income, and it moderately increases, but what it's more, it is continuous. And then there is retirement. All of a sudden, maybe it's anticipated because it's compulsory, it's retirement. And your income decreases, so the model says, okay, you save during your working life just to prepare for your retirement period, because your retirement period you have either no labor income or very low. So you have to save. The state provide, let's say, a contract, a collective contract for this to be done. And it is done typically in a compulsory way. So you enter a public pension system, you pay contributions that are called taxes, but in reality is forced saving. And then you acquired, you get a kind of rights by staying there, by paying contribution, and you will be paid your pensions. And then you have all the complications. But you see the work profile of this person, the wage profile is continuous. He already said that working life today are no longer like this. So to represent the working life of an individual like this today is grossly mistaken. Not only in the first part. We all say, okay, in the first part, entering the labor market is complicated. So you start, and then you exit, and then you re-enter, and then you exit. You have all these called atypical contracts. Atypical contracts meaning that you are not granted a open-ended contract since the beginning. You start and you have a quite precarious beginning. But if it were just like this, a precarious beginning, and then maybe at 30, you enter and you are stabilized with the kind of open-ended contract that was typical in the past, then you could recover your pension, let's say financing your pension plan, even in the public system. But today we know that the prospect, the possibility to be unemployed is much higher, even when you are mature. In particular, what is more important is that everywhere, but particularly in Europe, the labor market is segmented. What does it mean, segmented? It means that there are some groups that are protected and other groups that are excluded or marginalized from the labor market. Women, for example, almost everywhere. He mentioned the possibility today that women have to create their own pension and cannot rely on survivor pension. But the working career of women is still largely poorer than men, more discontinuous, and in many cases to women are left all the care work for children and for elderly parents that are not organized collectively and that should be part of a welfare system. So what does this mean? It means that when you look at retirement, when you prepare a pension reform, you really have to look at what happens in the labor market, because it is through the labor market that your pension is formed. And that's why the two reforms should be integrated. Does it happen? I'll show you how. This is Italy, November 2011, exactly when the technocratic government was called in to do reforms. It was under an emergency situation. A financial crisis was incumbent to the country. And so what is this? The sense of urgency. I have reported Krugman, New York Times, now with Italy falling off a cliff, it's hard to see how the euro can survive at all. This is Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize. Or Time, Italy, the worst, most dangerous economy. And Germany also. Now, we were called in, pension reforms, 2 weeks. This is the time I was given. Can you think now in terms of, okay, let's consider the labor market. Let's design in terms of design. I should have taken all your suggestions, which already I was convinced of even before becoming a minister. But there was no time. What is the lesson here? The lesson is that we were not able to convince, at least in some countries, that reforms have to be anticipated with respect to a situation of crisis. When you are in a crisis, you have to act immediately, and it's very important what you do for the credibility, because there was a message there that international financial markets had to take, and that message was, we are doing things seriously now. And the message should have been taken by the international financial markets. Mind you, Italy was and still is in a situation whereby, on average, ask financial markets 1 billion euro per day. This is the situation of our debt. So on average, we ask financial markets 1 billion euro per day. So having financial markets convinced that you are doing seriously the reform was very important. There was no time, so what did we do? We increased the retirement age in a sharp way, because it was necessary. we cut all the kind of, you may call privileges, in any case, the kind of seniority pensions, pensions that were awarded only according to your seniority and had no correction for your age. So if you started at 16, and that is of course a disadvantage, I'm not saying that you were advantaged, retiring at 56 is quite early. With no correction is early. And we equalized the retirement age of men and women, and I decided that for credibility reasons, it would be very important to pass immediately to the new defined contribution formula, because it had been put in a reform many, many years before, but it was no longer credible. Every time you speak to somebody about the DC formula, a politician in particular, or a trade union leader, they would say, well, DC, perfect from a theoretical point of view, but, and the but meant, but we can do better than an actuarial formula. And when you have politicians saying we can do better, then you know that interference is there, and the formula is no longer credibility. So immediately after this, 2 weeks, the labor market reform was prepared. And it was prepared saying, okay, what do we want for a labor market reform? Because you asked to speak about the reform. And again, here there is a lot of misunderstanding about what a labor market reform is. Why? Because people expect that after a labor market reform, they see job increasing. The number of jobs increase immediately after. They want to see more jobs. But it does not happen immediately, and it does not happen in particular in a recession. And Italy has been and continue to be in a recession. So a labor market reform is something that has to do with rules, with regulations, with contracts, with dismissals. All the kind of regulation has nothing to do with the macroeconomic situation of the country. Has not much to do with the demand for labor. Has to do with the supply. It's more on the supply side. And so, if people do not understand this, the possibility here that the trade-off, which is critical between short-term effects and long-term effects, is not understood, and the reform is said to be mistaken since the beginning. I'm saying you are in a recession, difficult period, there is a shortage of jobs, okay? You do a reform which is structural, to improve labor market regulations, entry, exit, social protection schemes that are very important, activation policies, labor services, all this is a labor market reform. You do this, and then you are in a recession, and people say, but this is market restrictions. We don't want market restrictions in a recession. So the trade-off is that you do something for the medium term with the objective to improve productivity, which is the real issue, productivity and number of jobs, but productivity. Then in the short run, you don't see any effect. And this means that people are really disappointed, are angry, and consider that the reform is a failure. To me, after these two reforms, is it my time finished? Because I have lost the presentation. I had more or less. I just finished with this. To me, what I have learned is I could put in this way. Reforms always have a very important technical content. The technical part we economists know. We know the implications for policy design, and there is an agreement. But this is just a part of a complex reform process. There are other two very important elements on which to which we have dedicated less attention. And these two elements are inform, so good and transparent information to people, because people have to accept, to endorse the reform. So transparent information about the reform is very, very important. And the third, you already mentioned, is education. People have to understand. If they don't understand, they don't buy the reform, and the reform simply is not effective. And this requires much more than simply devising good technical solutions for social problems. Because, as I said, a reform is like a social investment. There are sacrifices always involved in the short term. Sacrifices may be pervasive, like with a pension reform or a labor market reform, or can be concentrated, but there are always sacrifices in the present. But there are future gains for society. If people don't see those future gains, they consider that the reforms are simply the product of austerity. And they don't understand austerity, and they don't see the point for austerity, and they simply refuse. So I think that we have to insist on a new paradigm, which I strongly consider a very important necessity in our difficult times, which is reform, inform, and educate. To me, the two second pillars are equally important than the first. Okay.